devised by Saunders, 1955, and Eysenck, 1954. Among the most widely used such instruments was a scale developed by Budner, 1962, including 16 items designed to tap the various dimensions of ambiguity tolerance identified in the previous literature. Various other measures of ambiguity tolerance were devised, see Farnham and Ribchester, 1995, for a review. For instance, Kreitler, McGuinn, and Kreitler, 1975, presented 45 participants with several different tasks, yielding 12 different measures of ambiguity tolerance. On the basis of their data, they found 3 distinct classes of ambiguity tolerance behaviors: intolerance of 1. Situations admitting of multiple interpretations, 2. Situations that are difficult to categorize, and 3. Situations involving contradictions and conflicts. The notion of ambiguity tolerance has been applied in the domain of organizational behavior. Keenan and McBain, 1979, measured ambiguity tolerance by the Budner, 1962, questionnaire and found that for individuals with a high intolerance for ambiguity, role ambiguity was negatively correlated with job satisfaction but positively correlated with tension at work. Along the same lines, Fron, 1990, found in a meta-analysis that ambiguity tolerance moderates the relationship between role ambiguity and strain. Bennett, Herald, and Ashford, 1990, found a negative relation between ambiguity tolerance and the tendency to seek feedback in organizations. Farnham and Ribchester, 1995, summarized this work by concluding that, where good research has been done with representative samples and robust and realistic dependent measures, it has proven to be a highly predictive individual difference variable. Clearly, individuals with low IT appear to be more sensitive to stress, more risk-averse, and more sensitive to particular kinds of feedback, page 193. IT has been occasionally regarded as a characteristic of organizational climates. In this vein, Farnham and Gunter, 1993, observed that some organizations may be, implicitly, selecting persons who are low or high on ambiguity tolerance, and thus may imbue their organizational climate in specific ways. Furthermore, various organizations, e.g., the military, may have structure and/or subscribe to values that encourage intolerance of ambiguity, whereas other organizations, e.g., political parties or reading clubs, may encourage substantial tolerance of ambiguity. Little research has examined these possibilities empirically, however. Farnham and Gunter's, 1993, theorizing about organizational climates that vary on the tolerance-intolerance of ambiguity dimension echoes the present notion that the need for closure may be aroused situationally. More generally, the intolerance of ambiguity concept is akin in many ways to that of the need for closure, and the numerous presumptive correlates of the intolerance of ambiguity are similar to various need for closure effects described in Chapter 2. Thus, in a way, the present work is continuous with the tradition, though it extends it well beyond its putative dynamic antecedents, allowing as it does for its acquisition via social learning, and emphasizing the possibility of situational inductions of ambiguity tolerance or intolerance. Furthermore, the present framework is more explicit and systematic than ambiguity tolerance theory about the multiple consequences of the need for closure, deriving them from the urgency and permanence tendencies aroused by the need for closure. Uncertainty avoidance. The notion that attitudes toward ambiguity may characterize larger social entities underlies Hofstede's, 1984, work on uncertainty avoidance. Across cultures, whereas notions of uncertainty and ambiguity may not be fully isomorphic, the affinity between the two is considerable, as Hofstede acknowledged. Hofstede's thesis has been that all societies deal with various natural uncertainties to which they are exposed. They invoke laws to deal with uncertainties stemming from the behavior of other people, and they turn to religion to provide unambiguous answers in domains that transcend common or scientific knowledge. Hofstede devised an uncertainty index based on responses to 3 questions on 1. rule orientation, 2. Stability of employment, and 3. Stress. He then rank-ordered 40 countries according to their uncertainty avoidance scores, and demonstrated that uncertainty avoidance is related to such important social tendencies as lower ambition for advancement, bias in favor of specialists over management positions, a preference for large over small organizations, placing greater positive value on organizational loyalty, eschewal of competition among employees, and the preference for group decisions and consultative management over individual decisions. Dislike of being employed by a foreigner, and resistance to change. Finally, Hofstede speculated that uncertainty avoidance at the level of culture impacts the personalities of members. Individuals socialized in an uncertainty-avoiding culture may develop an inclination to avoid uncertainty as well, whereas ones socialized in less avoidant cultures would be more tolerant of uncertainty. Conceptually, uncertainty avoidance is highly similar to the need for non-specific closure. Furthermore, Hofstede's notion that cultural values and goals may determine the degree to which uncertainty is perceived as bothersome fits well with the present notion that the need for closure could be a function of a wide set of factors among which cultural values and objectives may certainly be included. 1. Conservatism. Another concept related to intolerance of ambiguity and authoritarianism is conservatism. The study of this construct commenced with the work of Lentz, who was primarily interested in character and ethical development defined as the concern for the welfare of others, 1929. Based on a questionnaire measure, Lentz, 1930, page 539, concluded that conservatism for certain purposes can be considered a general trait, unrelated to intelligence or acquiescence. Validation studies showed that people who call themselves conservative or middle of the road and who have not changed their church or who did or would vote for Hoover or Smith or Roosevelt, or who are enrolled in the small denominational call Leagues, make respectively higher conservative scores on the test than those who rate themselves as radical or who have changed their church or who would or did vote for Norman Thomas or who are enrolled in the large universities. Page 1. Eysenck, 1955, reported that 77% of the highest class in England voted Conservative, while only 8% voted Labour. By contrast, only 20% of the lowest class voted Conservative, but 52% voted Labour. He developed a two-factor theory of social attitudes including the dimensions of conservatism, radicalism, and tough-mindedness, tender-mindedness. Eysenck's conservatism notion included favorable attitudes toward patriotism, Sunday observance, capital punishment, the church, harsh treatment of criminals, a belief in the inevitability of war, and in the reality of God. At the other extreme were found a cluster of radical beliefs favoring communism, pacifism, birth control, divorce reform, sexual freedom, and a belief in evolution, pp. 118 to 119. And in a later work, Eysenck and Will. Son, 1978, asserted that there can be no doubt that conceptions like the authoritarian personality, dogmatism, Machiavellianism, ethnocentricity, tough-mindedness overlap to a considerable extent, pp. VV. General expectation of positive things from oneself and others may foster an openness to new ideas. A theory of conservatism based on such a notion was developed by Sylvan Tompkins, 1963, who hypothesized a strong link between general affective positivity and ideology. Tompkins hypothesized that, how positively or how negatively a human being learns to feel about himself and about other human beings will determine his general posture toward the entire ideological domain. 1965, page 97. In support of these notions, Tompkins, 1963, reported significant positive correlations between a positive trust in human nature, whereby human beings are basically good, and humanistic philosophy of science, a preference for democratic government, empathy, permissive discipline, faith in feelings, and variety, on the one hand, and between a generalized distrust, whereby human beings are basically evil, a positivistic philosophy of science, a preference for punitive government, lack of empathy, directive discipline, fear of feelings, and hierarchical selectivity. A different theoretical underpinning of conservatism was postulated by Wilson, 1973. Wilson's thesis was psychodynamic to some extent, and it held that conservatism is a generalized susceptibility to experiencing threat or anxiety in the face of uncertainty, page 259. Accordingly, conservative attitudes serve a defensive function. The conservative attitude syndrome serves an ego-defensive function, arising as a response to feelings of insecurity and inferiority, and a generalized fear of uncertainty, pp 261-265. Using the known groups approach, Wilson validated his C-scale, i.e., conservatism, by successfully discriminating between social ISTs and conservatives, religionists and scientists, as well as humanists and members of the Salvation Army. Furthermore, the C-scale correlated significantly with authoritarianism, 0.68, with rigidity, 0.51, and with dogmatism, 0.39. Wilson further found that conservative parents tended to produce conservative children, page 258, and that the conservative syndrome includes religious dogmatism, right-wing political orientation, in Western countries, militarism, ethnocentrism, intolerance of minority groups, authoritarianism, punitiveness, anti-hedonism, conformity, conventionality, superstition and opposition to scientific progress, page 257. Eckhart, 1991, viewed conservatism research in terms of its affective, behavioral, cognitive, ideological, and moral correlates. As he put it, effectively, the conservative tends to be optimistic, leadership-oriented, conformist, disciplined, extroversive, and misanthropic. Behaviorally, the conservative tends to support capitalism and to go to a conventional church. Cognitively, the conservative tends to be dogmatic, positivistic, rigid, intolerant of ambiguity, and to hold hereditary theories of human behavior. Ideologically, the conservative tends to be capitalistic, militaristic, nationalistic, and prejudiced. Morally, the conservative is authoritarian, bureaucratic, censorious, religious, punitive, conformist, and law and order oriented, page 108. Though the notion of conservatism is related to the need for closure, there are important differences here as well. The similarity between the two notions hinges on strivings for permanence. The need for closure is assumed to induce and that imply adherence to existing notions and defense of the status quo, corresponding to key aspects of conservatism. For discussion see Jost, Glaser, Kruglanski, and Salovey, 2003 A, B. The main difference is that conservatism has been typically thought of as an ideology that is a set of positions on various content-related issues, e.g., capitalism, religiosity, punitivity. The need for closure, by contrast, refers to a content-free tendency to seize and freeze on any relevant notions that happen to be accessible. In that regard, a person with a high need for closure may well be a rigid or conservative liberal, if liberal notions were accessible in her or his environment. Jost, Kruglanski, and Simon, 1999. More about this later. Dogmatism. Even though Adorno et al.'s 1950 explicit concern was with authoritarianism of the right, the major operationalization of the concept, the F-scale, was criticized for neglecting the authoritarianism of the left. Part-lying reaction to this alleged asymmetry, Rokeach, 1960, developed the dogmatism scale meant to provide a value-free measure of authoritarianism. The dogmatism scale contained items tapping double-think subscription to logically contradictory beliefs, denial of contradictions in one's belief system, a narrow future orientation and a strong orientation toward authority. According to Rokeach, dogmatism is indicative of closed-mindedness that contrasts with an open-minded attitude allowing one, to distinguish information from source of information and to evaluate each on its own merits, page 396. Rokeach, page 420, found that dogmatism loaded 0.71 on a general factor on which the following were also loaded: authoritarianism, 0.78, ethno-centrism, 0.73, rigidity, 0.68, right opinionation, 0.64, conservatism, 0.49, paranoia, 0.47, anxiety, 0.44, and self-rejection, 0.41. Barker, 1963, further found that high scorers on the dogmatism scale tended to be intolerant of ambiguity, given to stereotypes, opinionated, and submissive to authority. A certain amount of discussion revolved around the question of whether dogmatism or authoritarianism can characterize the left end of the political spectrum. Eysenck, 1955, 1969, Rokeach, 1960, even as they characterize the political right. Eckhart, 1991, summarized the debate as follows: so far as authoritarianism is used in the strict sense to refer to fascists or pre-fascists, then, by definition, there are no authoritarians on the left, who are, again by definition, equalitarians. However, if authoritarianism is used in a more general sense to refer to dominance, submission relations, then of course there are authoritarians of the left and center as well as of the right, pp. 114 to 115. In other words, at any point of the political left-right spectrum, there seems to exist considerable variability in the degree to which people exhibit dogmatism, conceptual rigidity, or authoritarianism. Yet on the average, authoritarianism and dogmatism are higher as one moves from the political left to the political right. I shall revisit this particular asymmetry at a later juncture. Rokeach's 1960 work on the dogmatism scale was closely linked to his more general theorizing about open versus closed belief systems. Indeed, his conceptual framework was quite elaborate and distinct in some ways from the theoretical rationale given for kindred individual difference concepts like authoritarianism or conservatism. As he expressed it, a basic characteristic that defines the extent to which a person's system is open or closed is the extent to which the person can receive, evaluate, and act on relevant information received from the outside on its own intrinsic merits, unencumbered by irrelevant factors in the situation arising from within the person or from the outside. Irrelevant internal pressures that interfere with the realistic reception of information are unrelated habits, beliefs, and perceptual cues, irrational ego motives, power needs, the need for self-aggrandizement, the need to allay anxiety, and so forth. Irrelevant external pressures are, particularly the pressures of reward and punishment arising from external authority, for example, as exerted by parents, peers, other authority figures, reference groups, social and institutional norms, and cultural norms. The more open one's belief system, the more should evaluating and acting on information proceed independently on its own merits, in accord with the inner structural requirements of the situation. Also, the more open the belief system, the more should the person be governed in his actions by internal self-actualizing forces and the less by irrational inner forces. pp. 57 to 58. According to Rokeach, furthermore, all belief-disbelief systems serve two powerful and conflicting sets of motives at the same time: the need for a cognitive framework to know and to understand, and the need to ward off threatening aspects of reality. To the extent that the cognitive need to know is predominant and the need to ward off threat is absent, open systems should result. But as the need to ward off threat becomes stronger, the cognitive need to know should become weaker, resulting in more closed belief systems. Page 67. All this implies a negative relation between the need to know and closed-mindedness. However, Rokeach was not entirely consistent in the role he accorded to the need to know, for in another passage significantly anticipating the present theory, he also wrote, "If the closed or dogmatic mind is extremely resistant to change, It may be so not only because it allays anxiety but also because it satisfies the need to know. Page 68, clearly implying a positive relation between the need to know, or to have firm cognitive closure, and closed-mindedness. Furthermore, Rokich's analysis implies that there is a way of objectively assessing the intrinsic merits of the information, and that the contents of a source's pronouncements are necessarily more relevant or diagnostic, with respect to the matter at hand than information about the source's perceived characteristics. Hence the closed-minded persons who attend more to the source than the contents are likely to be in error more than the open-minded persons with the opposite emphasis. By contrast, the present analysis views informational relevance as a largely subjective rather than objective matter. See Kruglansky and Thomson, 1999a, b. Erb. Kruglansky, Chun, Piero, and Spiegel, 2003. From this perspective, the source's statements and/or its characteristics could constitute information types that some individuals would view as subjectively relevant to given conclusions. For individuals who believe that experts are right, for example, the expertise of a source would be highly relevant to accept in the conclusions advocated, no less so, if not more, than the intrinsic features of the message. As discussed earlier, closed and open-mindedness in our framework refer to the readiness to process novel information, not to the kind of information processed. Openness to experience. McRae, 1996, recently argued that of the 5 basic dimensions of personality, the so-called Big Five, openness to experience is the most relevant to understanding social and interpersonal phenomena. According to McRae and Coster, 1992, openness relates to the breadth, depth, and permeability of consciousness, and in the recurrent need to enlarge and examine experience, page 2. Openness to experience is conceived of as a broad and general dimension that manifests itself in the vividness of fantasy, artistic sensitivity, depth of feeling, behavioral flexibility, intellectual curiosity, and unconventional attitudes, all assessed by the openness facets of the revised Neo-Personality Inventory, Neo-PIR, Coster and McRae, 1992. On the basis of behavior genetics research, Lolan, 1992, the results of which attest to strong heritabilities and little influence of shared environments on children's subsequent adult personalities, McRae, 1996, suggests that the predispositions toward openness or closedness may be inherited rather than learned. An important correlate of openness is the willingness to consider new cultural ideas and new ways of living. In this vein, Yeek and Bond, 1993, found a relatively high correlation, R equals 0.40, between Hong Kong students' tendency to rate themselves as extremely westernized versus extremely Chinese, and their openness to experience scores. The openness to experience facets were also significantly and negatively correlated, RS ranging from 0.21 to 0.64, Trapnell, 1994, with political conservatism as assessed by the Wilson-Patterson Conservatism Scale, Wilson and Patterson, 1968, and Altemeyers, 1981, right-wing authoritarianism. Coster and McRae, 1978, reported significant negative correlations ranging from -0.20 to 0.61 between openness to experience facets and Levinson and Huffman's, 1955, traditional family ideology scale. Furthermore, whereas there is no evidence for concordance of personality among couples on neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, or consciousness, there is clearly such evidence with regard to openness. There is also evidence of concordance in perceived openness in oneself and in ideal friend, Cheng, Bond, and Chan, 1995. Furthermore, openness is related to vocational interests, Holland, Johnston, Huey, and Asama. 1991, suggesting that it is also related to the development of professional and friendship ties between people. In short, the personality dimension of openness to experience seems relevant to a broad range of social phenomena including political attitudes, interpersonal choices and relations, and the reactions to cultural innovations and social change. It is clearly a significant factor of interest that should be studied more broadly in reference to a variety of social psychological research. It will be of particular interest to study the relations between openness to experience and the need for closure. The fundamental conceptual commonality between the two is obvious in that both relate to the positive acceptance versus rejection of new information. But there also exist some substantial differences in the ways in which these constructs have been conceptualized. Whereas openness to experience is thought of primarily as a heritable personality dimension, the need for non-specific closure is thought of as a psychological state that varies not only as a function of personality, but also as a function of the situation and of culture. Hofstede, 1980. The need for closure is thought of as a motivational construct, whereas openness is defined in terms of individual differ. Answers in the Structure and Functioning of the Mind, McRae, 1996, page 1. Emphasis mine. Finally, need for closure theory makes certain specific assumptions as to the mediating mechanisms of need for closure effects relating to the urgency and permanence tendencies this need may evoke. By contrast, the openness to experience concept is less committed, at least thus far, to specific mediating mechanisms of its putative effects. Uncertainty and certainty orientation. An intensive research program highly relevant to issues of closed and open-mindedness was launched over a decade ago by Richard Sorrentino and his colleagues, Sorrentino and Short, 1986. For a recent review see saw. Rentino and Roney, 1999. Like the previous approaches considered in this chapter, Sorrentino also emphasized individual differences. Specifically, he defined a continuum of uncertainty orientation at one end of which are those who find uncertainty a challenge. These people are called uncertainty-oriented, as approaching and resolving uncertainty has become part of their way of thinking about the world. At the other end of the continuum are those who view uncertainty as something to be avoided. These are people who are certainty-oriented, as clinging to the familiar, predictable, and certain are their particular ways of thinking about the world. pp. 3-4. According to Sorrentino and Roney, both the certainty and the uncertainty-oriented persons wish to attain certainty. But whereas the uncertainty-oriented persons approach uncertainty in order to resolve it, the certainty-oriented persons avoid it altogether. Like several previous authors reviewed in this chapter, Sorrentino and Roney view the etiology of uncertainty and certainty orientations from a psychodynamic perspective. Specifically, they regard the uncertainty-oriented individual as one who likely made it through the oral, anal, and phallic stages of development relatively successfully, developing a basic trust in the world, a sense of autonomy, and a desire to explore new worlds. Page 4. By contrast, the certainty-oriented individual likely did not make it through the oral, anal, and phallic stages of development relatively successfully. Consequently, this person developed a basic trust in the world, a lack of a sense of autonomy, and a desire to adhere to predictable and familiar worlds. This person is oriented toward maintenance of present clarity about the self and the environment. Page 7. Sorrentino and Roney assume that the wish to resolve uncertainty is independent of the desire for clarity and predictability. And an individual standing on the uncertainty orientation continuum is assumed to be the result of these two tendencies. One of these, uncertainty, is measured via a projective technique of sentence completion, Atkinson, 1958. The second is assessed via Cherry and Burns, 1977, measure of authoritarianism. Based on these measures, an uncertainty orientation score is calculated for each individual by subtracting his standardized score of authoritarianism from a standardized score on uncertainty. Sorrentino's rich research program has uncovered a wide variety of ways in which the uncertainty and certainty-oriented individuals differ, e.g., in their degree of interest in self-discovery, the readiness to deal with self-discrepancies, reactions to self-discrepancies, attention to ambiguous situations, rigidity of cognitive structures, reactions to persuasion, behavior in achievement situations, trust in interpersonal relations, attachment styles, reactions to leadership styles, exposure to health-threatening information, and more. For a review, see Sorrentino and Roney, 1999. Sorrentino's theoretical framework differs from the present one in several respects. Whereas he views both the certainty and the uncertainty-oriented individuals as ultimately motivated to arrive at a clear knowledge and in this sense to achieve closure, our work defines a motivational continuum in persons' desire for closure at one extreme of which individuals are, in fact, motivated to avoid closure. Moreover, Sorrentino's work treats uncertainty and certainty orientations exclusively in individual difference terms, whereas the present approach views the desire for closure, or closure avoidance, in terms of their epistemic functions that can be evoked situationally as well as differentially by various personality types or cultures. Finally, Sorrentino views the developmental antecedents of uncertainty, certainty orientations in psychodynamic terms, whereas the present theory assumes a wide variety of possible antecedents of closed and open-mindedness related to their perceived costs and benefits for given individuals and/or in given situations. Summary: prior psychological treatments of closed-mindedness and the present framework. In summary, the concepts of closed and open-mindedness have received a fair amount of consideration in the psychological literature. Admittedly, the different programs of research reviewed in this chapter accorded these concepts varying degrees of emphasis or direct attention. In the work of Piaget and Freud, they are touched upon rather tangentially and indirectly, as they are in the cognitive consistency theories. E.g., of Festinger, 1957, Heder, 1958, or Kagan, 1972, an analysis of information processing motivations for self-assessment, Festinger, 1954. Thrope, 1975, 1986, or self-verification, Swan and Pelham, 1988, Swan et al., 1992. Issues of closed and open-mindedness are more focal too. Research on authoritarianism, Adorno et al., 1950, conservatism, Eysenck, 1955, Eysenck and Wilson, 1978, Tompkins, 1963, Wilson, 1973. Dogmatism, Rokeach, 1960, and certainty and uncertainty orientations, Sorrentino and Roney, 1999. As a possible consequence of such differential centrality, different treatments of closed and open-mindedness varied in the degree of elaboration accorded these concepts. Theorists to whose work these phenomena were peripheral, like Piaget, Freud, or the cognitive consistency theorists, did not elaborate much on circumstances likely to affect them, whereas authors to whose work they were more central, like Adorno et al., 1950 or Rokeach, 1960, for example, provided more detailed analyses of such conditions. The substance of analyses relevant to closed-mindedness also differed widely. The cognitive consistency theorists, for example, postulated a need for consistency, cf. Festinger, 1957, Heder, 1958, or uncertainty reduction, Kagan, 1972, as a major mechanism responsible for closure strivings. Such need was assumed to be aroused by a situational encounter with a cognitive inconsistency, particularly if the cognitions involved were important to the individual, Festinger, 1957. In contrast to the situational analyses offered by the cognitive consistency theorists, the various individual difference approaches viewed tendencies toward closed or open-mindedness as a matter of personality style, e.g., Adorno et al., 1950, Rokeach, 1960. Accordingly, they identified a wide heterogeneity of notions, largely influenced by psychoanalytic theorizing, to account for individuals' socialization to closed versus open-minded functioning. In this vein, Adorno et al., invoked parental harshness and strict discipline as the critical antecedents of authoritarianism. Frankel Brunswick, 1948, invoked ambivalence toward one's parents as a critical causal factor behind the intolerance of ambiguity. Hofstede, 1984, invoked societal norms and laws as critically relevant to uncertainty avoidance. Tompkins, 1962, stressed the learning of generalized positive or negative attitudes towards self and others as the underlying factor of conservatism. Wilson, 1973, viewed conservatism as the consequence of susceptibility to anxiety and threat in the face of uncertainty. Rokeach, 1960, invoked the presence of threat and the pressures of reward and punishment by authority figures as the developmental cause of dogmatism. And Sorrentino, e.g., with Short, 1986, with Roney, 1999, emphasized the successful passage through the oral and the anal stages of psychosexual development as the responsible factor for the forging of certainty versus uncertainty orientation. The different approaches to closed and open-mindedness also differed in their emphasis on one versus the other, and on the adaptive value they attached to each. Jansch, 1938, for example, viewed open-mindedness as a symptom of psychological morbidity. From an entirely different perspective, various social psychological theories, e.g., the cognitive consistency models, self-assessment, social comparison, and self-verification notions, also emphasized the quest for closure, or firm knowledge, as the typical or normal tendency for most humans. Other approaches took the opposite stance and pronounced closed-mindedness as a somewhat pathological, maladaptive state of mind. Cf. Adorno et al., 1950, Rokeach, 1960, Sorrentino and Roney, 1999. As the foregoing analysis makes clear, the present perspective on closed and open-mindedness differs substantially from prior pertinent notions in several major respects. First, its point of departure recognizes that both closed and open-mindedness are essential to knowledge acquisition. Accordingly, some degree of open-mindedness is necessary to gather relevant information for decision-making and actions, but some degree of closed-mindedness is also necessary lest one remain buried in thought and unable to make a cognitive commitment imperative for getting on with the task at hand. From that perspective, whereas excessive closed or open-mindedness could be detrimental in some contexts, neither state in and of itself should be considered psychologically healthier or more adaptive than the other. Second, the present treatment offers a more general as well as more specifically elaborated analysis of closed and open-mindedness than most prior approaches. Accordingly, several different cases of closed and open-mindedness are presently distinguished depending on their motivational basis, having to do with needs for and for the avoidance of specific and non-specific closures. Also, compared to most prior notions, the present framework offers a broader conception of the antecedent conditions of closed and open-mindedness. Whereas the prior approaches focused on a rather narrow set of putative antecedent conditions of those states having to do with specific motives, e.g., to allay anxiety or threat, the present conception is based on the perceived benefits or costs of closure or the lack of closure, hence it admits the potential relevance to the development of closed versus open-mindedness of a broad universe of circumstances having to do with socialization variables or the family dynamics stressed by some theorists, e.g., Frankel Brunswick, 1948, Sorrentino and Roney, 1999, as well as societal norms stressed by other theorists, like Hofstede, 1984. However, beyond variables contributing to the development of closed and open-mindedness as relatively stable personality dispositions, the present analysis accords major attention to a wide variety of situational circumstances that may evoke powerful momentary tendencies toward closure or the avoidance of closure on a daily basis and from most individuals. Finally, to a greater degree than most of its predecessors, the present analysis elaborates the rationale behind the manifold consequences of closed versus open-minded states by deriving them from two motivational tendencies, those toward urgency of attaining closure and permanence in maintaining it. The subsequent chapters consider such consequences in greater detail.